Aló. Hello. Oye, ¿tú estás en el webinar? Ah, ok, que estoy aquí y yo dije chuleta, no sé a qué entré por el link que no era, porque el link, Nick mandó un poco de links esta mañana. Entonces, nada, entra para ver. Espérate. Coño, esta vaina ahora no se quiere poner en... Porque ya hay gente conectada. O sea, me pidió hasta yo pensaba, pues sí, ¿no? Pues me pidió hasta mis credenciales. ¿Me tienes?
Oh, coffee. I'll be right back. Cheers. I'm gonna unmute.
Cheers. Good morning.
Good morning. Some of the best coffee I've ever had in my life comes from Panama. So,
Yeah. All right. So we are, okay. So we're waiting for them.
yeah. So I'm just gonna, hey, Fran, good morning. Good morning, Fran. Here, oh, let's see, you're muted.
You're muted.
Here, I can unmute. I have that power. There we go.
Okay.
All right. And Linette is muted. I think there's a way to unmute everyone here. But, I can't. Oh, Linette, you have high level power to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm going to start the chat. Linette, you can unmute. Morning, Sabrina. Okay, and let's see. Get the chat over here. Cristián, good morning. Unmute. I should be able to unmute everybody. Okay. I think I have that power to unmute.
You're powerful, Nick. There you go.
It's really.
You unmute everyone. You control everyone here.
Yeah,
good morning, everyone.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, we're all here. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just going to do, you guys talk amongst yourselves, warm up. I still have some last minute bio review to do for the 3 panelists before I finalize my details here. But so I'm just going to be.
Can I get a piece of advice from you since you're looking at it?
Sure.
I'm trying this virtual background. Does it work, or do you want me no background? Whatever you prefer.
It is your preference. What I want you to feel comfortable so that you can best share your thoughts. So it doesn't matter to me, really.
I think it looks good. Yeah, I found when you blur the background, it can pixelate, you know, like the features around your head. But
yeah, a little bit.
Fine. Should I?
This is sort of this is my natural environment. That's why.
For sure. Not definitely. We know that, Cristián. It's like, you know.
Well, I changed my view from the thing I did yesterday because I had too much distraction in my background. So is this okay?
Sabrina had some good Easter eggs.
Something there in your background.
Yeah. Well, and I have books and photos, and you know, I just wasn't thinking about it.
So distracted by your books. I was reading all the titles. Oh, she's reading that? Really? I didn't know she.
Yeah, exactly. We get all these glimpses into each other's lives.
Yeah.
There you go. You all look fantastic. The background looks great. And I love the blue sky behind you, Fran. Looks really nice.
Yeah, well, it's raining in Boston, so it's wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah, yeah.
Here, let's see, I'm gonna see if I can share the slides that I had ready to go. The slides I gave were just, they're just decoration almost, or cues, but they're not meant to be anything particularly profound.
Nick, why are we showing 11 participants? I'm just curious. Who are the other 5?
They're starting to join in for.
Just take a minute to do that about, the relative importance of individuals versus institutions when we're doing science diplomacy. And, this is something that I reflected on quite a bit, actually, through Outbreak and Outbreak DIY. In developing the exhibit, I was relying on external partnerships and experts to cover this vast space of global health and One Health. Intergovernmental organizations like WHO and OIE, US government agencies like USAID, NIH, nonprofits like EcoHealth Alliance, international consortia like the PREDICT program and the Global Health Security Agenda. And it was very interesting to me that we were all representing, these really big structures and institutions, yet working in a capacity to some extent as individuals. And I don't think that you can separate the two. The individuals do the work and hold those relationships. But those institutions provide us with, I think, the infrastructure that we need oftentimes to really implement the plans that we're making and the collaborations that we're trying to form. And so I would say, again, I think that it takes really motivated, energetic, creative people, individuals, to make a lot of the major progress on the big challenges that we have in front of us. But at the same time, I don't know that I would be able to do what I've done without the institutional backing and recognition that I'm fortunate to have in connection with my work, and that is to a certain extent how we shape those relationships and actually synergize our efforts for the most effective solutions.
Well, thank you so much, Sabrina, and I think you bring a very well-rounded response to that question of using or leveraging an institution like the Smithsonian with your knowledge as a scientist and your scientific training through Young Scientists and the World Economic Forum to make a change around the world, and how you can continue doing that through the future. And certainly Outbreak has transcended the barriers of the museum, and STRI is a very clear example. We were able to use the exhibit because it is bilingual and reach teachers all the way in Central America in areas that are very remote. So definitely what you're doing impacts the world, and for sure will continue to do so. So thank you very much for that. With that, I would like to turn to Cristián. Cristián, as has already been highlighted, you have vast experience as founding director of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute, working for the Smithsonian, now leading WCS. And in your current role with oversight of museums and the New York Aquarium, you're also managing programs in 60 countries and all of the world's oceans. So you're certainly no stranger to a global challenge. So in your view, what do you think that we need for more and better science diplomacy? And what do you think will be different in the future in the way that science can transcend international boundaries for the benefit of the world?
Thanks, Linette. Well, I think let's just start by saying that science has no political boundaries, really. I mean, it is about pursuing our understanding of the world and some of the questions around this. But one of the things that I find very exciting is that we're moving more and more toward cross-disciplinary science, because so many of the important challenges that we face today as a society are things that will require different kinds of skill sets and communications. When we worked in Millennium Assessment, one of the things that was challenging, to be candid, was have a bunch of biologists interact with a bunch of economists and different disciplines that usually don't talk to each other, and try and come to a common language and a common understanding. So I think we need to really pursue that. And examples like the pandemics research and policy work that Sabrina mentioned is a good one. But the other thing that I think is really important is to see how we can work together and replicate this across countries to pursue these. And let me just give one example that, of course, it's a shout out to STRI and the work that's being done there. STRI is one of the premier global organizations in terms of tropical biology and research. And one of the early pioneering projects that was done there is a large-scale plot to understand the dynamics of tropical forests. That was done, a famous plot that's set up by Steve Hubble and Robin Foster and others. And it was really addressed initially or designed to address some very fundamental questions about dynamics of tropical rainforest. Now, this was then replicated with, who was my PhD advisor at Harvard, Peter Ashton, who decided to set up a similar plot in Asia to compare the results between what was being seen in Panama, what was seen in Asia, and see whether these conclusions could be similar. And this has, over the years, flourished into a network of these long-term, large-scale tropical forest plots around the world in what was the Center for Tropical Forest Science, that's now part of SIGO. And the remarkable thing there is it's by bringing the scientists together across many countries, many nationalities, but with a similar questions, similar methodology is very powerful in understanding this. I think it's a very good example of something the Smithsonian has been involved with. I think that the challenge and the opportunity looking forward is how we take that science and link it to some of the fundamental questions that society is facing. And in this case in particular, it's climate change. Because what we see as the world is confronting us and really trying to see how do we tackle this climate challenge, the one underrepresented solution is the nature-based solutions like the conservation of tropical forest, which account for almost 20% of the global CO2 emissions. Understanding how tropical forest ecosystems work, how much captured carbon is there and how much is being captured, and what role can they play in contributing to this global solution is really important. It's a good example about how a scientific network can interface with a policy arena and really help find some common solutions. I think we need more examples like that we can as a scientific community bring together, whether it's dealing with wildlife trade or climate and forest, or in the marine space, some of the issues that I think Fran will probably talk about. So I'm very excited about the opportunities, but I think that to address bigger questions that society is facing, we need more of these cross-disciplinary projects that we replicated, and we all work across nations, languages, and cultures to address them.
Thank you so much for that response, Cristián, and for bringing up the 50-hectare plot here in Panama on Barra Colorado Island. It's certainly a very interesting example of science crossing boundaries, of interfacing with policy, and about collaboration that has happened for 40 years and will hopefully happen for many more years. Right now, the project for the first time has been put on halt because of the pandemic. So we will have to figure out again collaboratively with scientific minds around the world how we can overcome some of the hurdles that it's currently facing because of the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you very much for that, Cristián. And to close this round of questions with your thoughts, I'd like to turn over to Fran. Fran, you've had a distinguished career in government as a professor, as chancellor of the University of Alaska Anchorage, and currently is chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, plus serving on multiple advisory roles. So based on this wealth of experience, what do you think is needed for more and better science diplomacy, and what are we going to have to do differently in the future to be more effective?
Well, thanks, Linette. Honestly, I'd just soon talk for about an hour on this topic because I have a lot of ideas, but I'll just give you a couple. So one of them starts with something very, very basic, which is that scientists have a hard time overcoming this sense that they shouldn't really go talk to a politician or policymaker. I mean, Cristián was talking about the difficulty of cross-disciplinary work and economists not talking to biologists. Let me just say that elected officials and scientists do speak entirely different languages and have very, very different approaches to how to think about problems and solve problems. So I will just say to the scientists who may be listening today, I know this sounds a little simplistic, but adopt a legislator. adopt a mayor, adopt a governor, adopt somebody in a policy position that you get to know and that you can communicate with about how the work that you are doing in science actually relates to the problem set that that elected official or that policy person actually is trying to address. And I know that sometimes that's an awkward and difficult thing, and but I remember as a legislator eons ago myself, when I was approached by a fisheries biologist who said, basically, I want to educate you about oceanography and about fisheries biology and about how the scientists support the regulators of fisheries to make sure that they can be sustainable fisheries. Honestly, had that scientist not come to me, I don't think I would have gone to him. And his willingness to communicate with me, connecting the work that that scientist and his team was doing to something I cared about, which was sustainable fisheries, it made a world of difference. So I would start with something fairly basic, actually, which is building relationships at a level where people listen to each other and learn to trust each other and can see the value in how one world can actually benefit the other world. I think in some ways, science diplomacy starts there. It is a very personal as well as institutional phenomenon when you can build bridges like that. So that's one thing I would offer up. And I know it sounds simple, but honestly, it matters. And the second thing that I would offer up from my university experiences, and I don't know, frankly, how unique this is to the United States of America versus other places, but I would say universities, both public and private, often set up incentives for young scientists to stay narrowly focused on their field and publish, publish, publish. And there isn't always an incentive to work outside of the boundaries of their particular field. Moreover, there's rarely an incentive to do public service. There's rarely an incentive to actually go looking for a way that they can bring their science to utility in the public sphere and find ways where you can actually bring knowledge to action. So that's another piece of the equation that I would offer up to the academics, to the administrators to think about. If you really want to make science a more robust and appreciated piece of the problem solving at both the local, national, and international level, you have to incentivize young scientists to actually work in that space. So I could go on and on, but I think I will just stop there.
Well, Fran, no, I think that has been magnificent. And honestly, I think adopt a legislator may just become a slogan inside the Smithsonian from now on. So thank you so much for that. But what you've talked about is really one of the fundamentals of science diplomacy, which is using scientific methodology and data to inform policy. So from speaking the language of a politician to being able to positively influence in that way to working in areas outside of science, it all becomes a part of building a better future through what science diplomacy can really bring. So thank you for that, and certainly adopt the legislator. It's in our hearts now. So with that, I'd like to thank the three of you and turn it over to Nick for some questions and answers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linette. Thank you, Oris. Thank you to all the panelists. This was a great start, and there's so much more to talk about. I'm going to open this up by taking a question from the question and answer, and they're largely about the same topic, which is about the role of the private sector in science diplomacy. And what I'm going to wrap that into is this issue about implementation. Cristián mentioned a bit about this using the example of the plot networks that were started in the tropics and now have extended across latitudes and used by many other institutions. The Smithsonian has a prominent example of using one that crosses across one set of networks that goes across many latitudes and creates this large data set that's accumulated over time to provide these insights. So you have data on one side that can then inform prescriptively specific policy objectives. So the question here is, what role does the private sector play? And I'm going to pitch that to Cristián first and then Fran, because they both have the ability, they both have experiences that are relevant to this.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, I think this is an extremely important issue. And I guess one thing we haven't emphasized enough, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals and the global agenda that was adopted by the UN. It's a very important global framework for sustainable development, including health, poverty, education, many other aspects, but also issues related to environment in some of the goals 14 and 15 in particular. And what's been very important is I've seen the private sector has a key role to play in delivering a lot of these issues. And many of the large companies I'm seeing worldwide have really adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as part of their framework. You look at a giant company like Unilever, for example, they have really taken this to heart in terms of looking at their contributions, the inputs that they're looking at, the products that they're selling, all the way from farm to table, is a very good example in terms of what we need to do. And I'm very heartened by that. The other place where I'm seeing a lot of key issues, of course, is in the area of climate change and emissions. We've seen an incredible diversity of companies that have come forward with pledges to reduce their own carbon emissions. We've also seen nations, most recently, for example, they pledged by the European Union to become carbon neutral by 2050 is something that I think gives us great hope. But it's been incredible to see the technological solutions that are being brought forth by the private sector, and some of these that are being made available. So I think we are reaching a tipping point in some of these things in a way that we can move this and accelerate the change. And a lot of people have been wondering is, with this pandemic, with what's happening to us right now, what's the consequence of this in that global agenda? And what I've been discussing the last week with some of the key decision makers, for example, in Europe, and private companies like Shell and others, is they actually want to accelerate the transition to a green economy model. I think it's something incredibly important and that we can contribute. So I think we need the academic sector, we clearly need the decision makers, we need the nonprofits, we need the private sector all working together to really be able to move this agenda forward. The last thing I'll mention here is was supposed to be, or still is, a very important year in terms of global agenda for biodiversity. This is a year when we were supposed to have a number of meetings leading up to the meeting in China that was going to set the next decade of the global agenda for biological diversity. Of course, the pandemic and everything has disrupted this. Most of these meetings have been postponed until next year. But I think there's a real opportunity to stop and reflect not only about the biodiversity agenda, but I think the really exciting thing I'm seeing is that the global biodiversity policy agenda is overlapping with the climate change agenda I discussed, and now with the health agenda. And what we need is more win-win solutions that can really, a single intervention and the science can inform this around what those intersections are that can help us build a more sustainable future for the planet.
Thank you, Cristián. Fran, in your experiences working with companies, do you have anything to add on about the role that the private sector can play? Cristián sketched out a very optimistic vision, and you've actually had very granular interactions. Is there any kind of sober reality to this in the current world and then moving forward?
Well, there are two parts of the private sector that I'd like to briefly address. One is the for-profit, that is corporations, et cetera, and the other is the nonprofit. The NGO space, the non-governmental organizations that I think of in the private sector space as a bridge sometimes between the for-profit and the government world that otherwise might be hard to bridge. So first of all, with regard to the for-profit, I would say that the fishing industry has to be part of any negotiation that deals with conservation in oceans, because they are in a position to really either make it work or not work based on their level of compliance. So I would say both in the Alaska space, in the Arctic space, I have seen both fishers and fish processors play a very important role in coming on board or not. And a great example of that is the recent moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. This was an amazing accomplishment. 10 countries of the world have agreed that they will not engage in commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean for 16 years. Not only Arctic nations, but major fishing countries, including China and Korea and the European Union. I would say that the private sector fishing industry in all of those countries kind of helped give green lights to that because of the agreed upon, it was really a consensus. We don't know enough about the fish, the ecosystem, how we would possibly manage a sustainable fishery in the Central Arctic Ocean, because we don't know enough. And so companies were willing to say, and fishers were willing to say, we will forego the potential because we recognize that by having an agreement that says nobody can fish there, it doesn't put anybody at risk. And it really is a great example of how both science diplomacy, the science community that helped give rise to that mutual agreement that we don't know enough to actually be able to regulate sustainably, and the fishing industry basically saying, we're not going to fight that because we see that as in everybody's best interest and it makes sense. And the countries having the courage to do that is a great example of that interconnection, not on an individual company basis, but an intersection. And with regard to the NGO sector, I would say a great example in ocean conservation was recently in the Seychelles that have accomplished this amazing achievement of protecting 30% of their oceans for conservation purposes. The Nature Conservancy and the Oak Foundation were principal reasons that there was both the science to support it and the ability financially to achieve that. Again, I see that as a private sector, even though that's not a company for profit, but without NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and without foundations like the Oak Foundation, those things wouldn't be possible. So I see science diplomacy as engaging in both the for-profit, the nonprofit, the science community, as well as the policy community to really make long-term gains for ocean conservation.
I think that's a great point, Fran, is that a lot of people who are trained as scientists come from actually a very narrow world where the universe is not that big in terms of social context. There's only a certain number of universities, there's a discrete amount of connections. And actually science fits into this broader context that is very, has so many dimensions to it that are real and happening at different scales. I think a lot of scientists are probably pretty sheltered from that viewpoint. So again, this goes back to your point about participation, getting scientists embedded in organizations and activities that get them interacting with domains, either in the private sector, and like you say, the private sector in itself is extremely diverse and has different goals and different modes. That's probably going to be one of the, that's actually the segue to the next question I'm going to ask. And I'm going to wrap in a few of the questions in the Q&A, also great questions in here. I don't think we'll have enough time to get to everything, but one commonality that's coming up is the need to communicate what scientists do better. And this has, in my view, been a shortcoming of scientists themselves and being unable to create the right narratives to explain how they know what they know, why their expertise is relevant, especially with respect to the applications to these different domains out there. So this is, I'd like maybe Sabrina and Fran to fill in to kind of provide their thoughts and reflections about this. Looking to the future, trying to formulate my question here. The public perception of science probably does need some rehabilitation. What would you do if you were queen of the world to change that? I'll go to Sabrina and then Fran.
Well, thank you for that. It's something that, you know, I think a number of us think about a lot and recognize as a big part of how we want to be thinking and what we want to be doing moving into the future and in the present. And Fran had some fantastic thoughts on this when she was talking about incentivizing scientists to engage with the public, to you know, seek applications and utilities of their work, and to be incentivized and rewarded for that. I think a real challenge in the traditional model of doing science is that there are these expectations and these requirements that are so demanding on our time and energy just to publish and to do all the other things and play the roles that are expected of the way that the scientific enterprise normally functions, that we simply do not get credit or do not see any, at this point, I think, rewards or opportunities to advance or be, I think, valued for those contributions. I can't say that what I've done, for example, with Outbreak and Outbreak DIY, certainly my institution and others recognize the impact of that work, but on paper, that is not going to weigh equally with traditional outputs that you have as a scientist, I think.
Right.
And so that is something that we need to change. It's not just the scientists having willingness and wanting to devote the energy to doing that, but actually having the support from their employers, from their leaders, from their communities to do that, to write op-eds and to join meetings and conferences and to sit at tables where decisions are made and their expertise is needed in ways that aren't traditionally part of what they do. And so I think that we have tremendous opportunities with these transformative technologies, that are part of these major trends that we see and that are part of what we need with global challenges in terms of communication with each other, across disciplines and divisions, with the public, and then actually, effectively using those platforms virtually, as well as to the extent that we can connect in other ways in order to, communicate those messages and create those impacts.
Thank you, Sabrina. Fran, this is about public perception of science and maybe more elaborating about the role of scientists to play in these settings.
So you said basically if I ruled the world, what would I change? I would start with improving scientific literacy in our world. And that starts in grade school, actually. I mean, if I could, I would wave my magic wand and have grade school science start with really exciting programs that, get kids to love science and understand it in a way that enriches their lives. And I would continue that all through K through 12. I think we have completely undervalued science and science literacy starting at the earliest level, which has led to, at least in my country and perhaps in others, not only a misunderstanding, but a fear of science as being somehow too complicated. It's like math, right? So that would be number one. And number two, I would engage in a heavy communication skill building set for all scientists before they get their BS, their master's, or their PhD about how to speak in English in a way that people who maybe aren't as comfortable in their field can actually relate to. I think it is both of those things would help. There are many other things that can be done, but starting at the basic level of reminding people of the many ways in which science has enhanced our lives, have made possible the economies that we enjoy, and have really brought to the quality of human life on this planet to an entirely different level, thanks to science.
I think that's really inspiring. That's, parts of Earth optimism is discriminating between what's truly inspiring and hopeful and what's practical and achievable. And I think you've outlined something that's really speaks to my heart. Cristián, do you have any last reflections to add before I turn it over to Linette?
I completely agree with Fran. I think science education is a big part of the solution here. It might be interesting, let me point out, I've been involved with a panel for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we've issued over the last 3 different reports on public perceptions of science in the US. The good news is scientists are still one of the most credible voices in the midst of all these issues. Now, as Fran said, the issue is that science doesn't always get translated and communicated in the right way at the right time to the right people. So I think really figuring out and strengthening our ability to communicate this to those decision makers and others is a really important issue. And also, I guess the one other issue I'd say, I would like to see more people in science bridging that gap and more scientists at the other side of the aisle to talk about this. I'm always stunned by how few people with a science background we have in Congress in the US or the legislatures in Latin America and others. I think we need to do it. And we as organizations, one of the things that we do is For example, we have created something called the International Conservation Caucus, which has more than 300 members of the US Congress. And we do this together with the other nonprofit groups, large conservation groups, to really create awareness about this, to advance an agenda, policy, and finance for these issues. One of the things we do is we create opportunities to take the people on field visits to see this firsthand. Creating more of those opportunities to learn from each other is good. And it doesn't just have to be to the field. I think you can actually do a great visit and a great tour to places like the Natural History Museum in Washington, because of course the collections that are there represent the world. And I think the opportunity to see those collections through the eyes of a curator that's done it, the kind of work you have done, Nick, and others, is an incredible opportunity to take a virtual or a real tour to this and through these museums, which are gateways to the world. I think we can help create awareness about the planet that we all share.
Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing that. Linette, I'll let you wrap up here in the last few minutes we have.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those responses, Nick, and for leading the Q&A section. Wrapping up talking about science communication is fantastic. And it truly speaks to the mission of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was founded for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So that absolutely speaks to all of us who work for this institution, and hopefully to everyone else who's listening in this morning. So that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thanks to all of you who've joined us this morning, to our panelists for inspiring us through their expertise, through their views on science diplomacy, and its increasing relevance in the future. So thank you to our moderators, to my colleagues, Dr. Oris Sanjur from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, to Dr. Nicholas Pyenson from the National Museum of Natural History, who made all of this come together. So thank you so much. And in the true spirit of Earth optimism, we need to change the conversation from doom and gloom to positivism and optimism. And really, science diplomacy shows us how to use and apply science, technology, and innovation to link people that can work together to solve global problems and impact national societies. So thank you again to our amazing panelists, to the Honorable Fran Ulmer, Chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, to Dr. Cristián Samper, President and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York, and to Dr. Sabrina Sholts, Curator of Biological Anthropology and Lead Curator of Outbreak at the National Museum of Natural History. So please stay tuned to the Earth Optimism Summit, and thank you very much again to all of you for joining us this morning. And I think with that, Nick, we are done.
I agree. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to everyone out there around the world. Have a great day. Stay healthy.
Thank you very much, everyone. Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.